Hello everyone, and thank you for taking the time to look into the Overproof Breaking Down the Bar report. I'm really excited for this presentation today, and I'm looking forward to showing you some insights and data associated with some of the top influencer accounts in the country, put into data visualization in ways that have never been done before in our industry. So this is data associated with 135 of the top influencing venues in the United States. These are the bars and restaurants that were nominated for the 2023 Tales of the Cocktail Awards. So some of the most influential accounts in the country. Out of those 135 venues, we were able to track 1,248 cocktails, 324 suppliers, 898 brands, which to note is about 40% higher than the national average we typically see for cocktail coverage. So what this lets us know is that these influencer leading accounts are monetizing more of their menu and getting more cocktail positions for top brands than some of the other bars that we see. A list of the venues that were included here. As we know, in the world of mixology, there's always going to be a handful of bars that do not offer menus and have their bartenders work off the cuff, if you will. You can see those accounts have been excluded from this list, and it still gives us more than enough to work with. That data is simply not included. And we're going to get right into the winners. Who wins in the cocktail? And this is focused entirely on cocktails on the menu. This is where we see a lot of the interesting notes of shifts throughout the year based on brand advocacy and bartender priority. Top suppliers Campari America jumps into this spot with a sizable lead over Bacardi, and this is where we see House Alpens creep into this list, where you don't normally see that on a national scale. I can tell you that on a national scale, if we went to every state and almost every city, I don't think you would see House Alpens on top of Pernod Ricard, Diageo, and Beam Suntory anywhere. And yet we see them in a top 3 position, really a true testament to bartender advocacy. When you look at how a small supplier focused on Dolan Vermouth and some of these other small brands is able to rise into prominence with top suppliers inside the country. Top brands in modifier, this is where we see Angostura bitters really stick out. As we know, the #1 modifier for most classics, a great modifier for most of the modern cocktails that are being created. And Campari, Coqui, and Chartreuse coming in right behind that. Chartreuse, despite allocation, still maintaining a top 5 spot inside of brand modifiers. Inside of base spirit, which we'll touch more on, Grey Goose coming into the top spot with Tanqueray and Forge Gin. I think 2 London dry style gins jumping into that top spot for base spirit speaks very highly, and Hendrick's dropping a little lower, which we'll see resurface into a top spot later on in this report. And then Del Maguey still being the preferred base spirit when it comes to agave for many of the mixology cocktails inside of these accounts. By product category, again, no surprise, most mixologists still leaning towards Amaro as being so much of a category. If you've walked into a top account in the country recently, I'm sure you've noticed an entire shelf of Amaro there at some point. And that's what continues to drive this category to have such a sizable lead over more base spirits like gin, rum, and herbal liqueurs. Who wins inside the venue? So again, this is more of a yes or no penetration question. What is your percentage of items, yes or no, inside of that venue based on your portfolio? And again, this is where we see Campari take on a sizable lead. They've done a great job through their expansive portfolio, which includes items like Appleton, Wild Turkey, Campari, Aperol, items which have become almost essential on so many cocktail menus, which allows them to maintain such a large percentage of the venue. And that's where we see, again, top brands by modifier. They maintain that top spot. But this is where we see Chartreuse, again, even on allocation, coming into that #2 spot. Still such a preferred brand for modifiers, and having used Chartreuse and all the modifiers on these lists, I think we can continue to speak to how it's one of the top modifier brands in the world and will remain there for quite a while. Top brands in base spirits, again, this really speaks to bartender preference. Mezcal, #1, Vodka, #2. Again, such a big shift this year that we see that happening. And then St. George Spirits coming into that #3 spot, equal with Hendrick's, which is a sizable increase on St. George in comparison to last year. Product category, again, we see Amaro with a little bit of a smaller lead, but still inside that top spot. And then the final is who wins on the menu, which is a combination of spirits lists and cocktail menus. So anywhere that you show up. Beam Suntory, Pernod Ricard, and Campari. Top three that I would look to see inside of there, and again, it's all of the top suppliers represented. Top brands, a reflection of those top suppliers right across. The only thing that really jumps out to me on this page is product category big time. Bourbon having almost a 5%, if not more, lead over tequila in product category on the menu. I think every chart that we look at, we know that tequila is driving in sales and volume, but that does not take away from bourbon's representation on menus nationwide and the continued desire to order bourbon for so many guests inside the market. Let's take a look at our top suppliers this year for the report, based on the categories in which the nominees were nominated for awards. Best restaurant bar and best cocktail bar is where we see Pernod Ricard inside the top spot for both of those things. And then we see best bar team and best new cocktail bar, Beam Suntory taking the top spot, with Diageo's incredible premium hotel team maintaining a lead inside best hotel bar, which is where we typically see Diageo and Pernod swap spots throughout the year in that category. As we look at our top brands that are continuing the trend inside of these categories, best cocktail bar, St. George, a true rise for a brand that has been around for as long as they have to be shown on this list with the likes of Wild Turkey, Woodford Reserve, Bacardi. Best hotel bar, Macallan, that doesn't surprise me much. I think about luxury hotels, top hotels being represented across the world, how they're associated with drinking Scotch neat in many cases, and how they most have long, elaborate Scotch lists associated in those accounts. And that's where you see Macallan taking on that luxury category associated with luxury hotel properties, which make up the majority of this list. When we say best hotel bars, you're not going to find most of the national chain hotels listed here. These are premium hotel lines that really invest in quality products. Best new cocktail bar, this really again speaks volumes. Old Forester and Del Maguey, two of the top workhorse products in our industry. Old Forester and Del Maguey for Mezcal and Bourbon are two of the best base spirits for price to quality that you can provide, and that's why we see them continually being used by these venues that are nominated. As we look at top cocktails, I think something that really stands out to me is the continued resurgence of the martini. This makes me very happy. The martini is the undisputed king of all cocktails. Things can continue to trend up and down as they want, but the martini will reign supreme. We've seen it go down and then re-rise to the top of this list over and over time. And it's a pleasure to see it back at the top here again. And I think that's why we see a lot of the shifts in category, like Grey Goose and Hendrick's, which we will see, maintaining some of those top brand spots inside of category, really being fueled by the resurgence of the martini. So let's jump into some of these categories here. Amaro. So back to the report that we looked at earlier in some of the categories inside those slides. Campari maintaining a significant lead. The biggest thing that jumps out in cocktail type here is the increase in modern style cocktails versus classics and twist on classics. And I'd like to retouch on that. A classic would be a Negroni, a Boulevardier, any other known Campari cocktail that you'd find in any one of these top guides or the Savoy cocktail book or known classic cocktails to bartenders. Twist on a classic would be any one of those classics then with a slight variation that does not divert too much from the classic itself. So a change in a base spirit on a traditional whiskey old fashioned to a rum or a rye or something of that nature could hit, or a martini variation that goes into a particular flavor could be a twist on a classic. And then modern is where you'll see mixology driven cocktails fall into place, which is where we see a shift for Campari this year in the report, with a lot of bartenders really using it for more experimental and mixology driven cocktails, as opposed to the push on Negroni variations, which we saw over the last couple of years. Bourbon, a true testament to Maker's Mark in this brand, one of the few categories where I see the identical #1 spot in Maker's Mark in top categories, both nationwide in our Overproof 200,000 menu database. Maker's Mark is still the top bourbon represented on menus. And then we narrow it down to the top 130 plus accounts in the United States, and Maker's Mark is still in the top spot. The only other brand that can claim that from looking at this report is Hendrick's in the other cases as we look at these, and that's very impressive to say as you look at two completely different pieces of the market. To maintain the top is a true testament to the longevity, quality, and marketing and advocacy done by this brand. Rum, again, this is a category where you would only really see plantation in this top spot as we look at these influencer accounts. If we look at a nationwide snapshot of top rums across the country, you'd be looking at Bacardi, Captain Morgan, Crucian, Myers, these brands, and then start to see plantation creeping into the mix. Plantation has done an incredible job this year of surpassing some of the brands like Sailor Jerry, Ron Zacapa, and some of the other ones that we've seen Don Q show up in this report in the past, and really continuing to solidify itself as an iconic brand in mixology bars. Gin, back to what I mentioned earlier, Hendrick's being the leading supplier brand, not only nationwide amongst 200,000 venues, but also amongst the leading bars inside the United States. And as we can see, based on the cocktail breakdown, it's defined application into a modern cocktail brand. If we look at classic martinis and what base spirits are going into them, it will not be Hendrick's. We're going to look at Forge Gin, Tanqueray, Grey Goose. It's when we look at modern mixology-driven cocktails is where we see Hendrick's really not only having made its name, but continuing to sustain its ability to be in the top spot. Tequila. Personally, very satisfied to see El Tesoro jumping back to the top of this spot. I love a lot of different tequila brands are out there, and we see this list change drastically based on marketing, availability, shifts in different demographics. El Tesoro is a fantastic product, and it's great to see it move back to the top of this list. It lets me know that decisions are still being made based on what bartenders really love and enjoy, and not being 100% fueled by supplier marketing. And then, of course, we see the top two players inside the space with Patron and Don Julio. The biggest change in this versus the entire market, Casamigos, not being found present inside a lot of the top three across those venues. As we go into Liqueur, I can tell you from looking at this data over the last few years, Cointreau and Grand Marnier continue to swap positions depending on what the time is, what market they're in, and what the span of the data that's being taken from. But the bottom line is they maintain complete control over the orange liqueur sector, maintaining a legitimate market share that overpowers the rest of the other orange liqueurs on the market. As we look at coffee liqueur, which is the next one that fits onto there, we again see Mr. Black trending high and Borghetti coming from the Branca portfolio doing very well as we see espresso martinis continue to make an impact. Vodka, definitely the biggest surprise for me in this entire report is Grey Goose being in the number one spot, not only for base spirits, but inside of vodka as a category. This is not something that you would have looked at consistently over the past 5 years, and it's a true testament to Grey Goose and the Bacardi portfolio team being able to sustain advocacy for this brand across the top bartender network in the country. Grey Goose is an outstanding product. We've known this for a long time. It did slip from prominence on these lists for quite a few years, but has now fought its way back to the top with a force. And they are there over top of brands like Kettle One and Absolute. And to compare it again to the national market, if I asked anybody what the top vodka in the USA was, I think everybody would jump out immediately and say Tito's. And we see that in the influencer accounts drop a little bit lower on these lists. And we see more of the bartender-driven brands of Kettle One and Absolute drive into those top three spots. And we can see, again, based on the prominence of martinis and the popularity, that martini is still beginning to fuel that cocktail. Scotch, when I took a look at this list, it was immediately associated with cocktails to me, with the exception of Johnny Walker, which I think performs best more on the single spirit list, which is where we're seeing these numbers. Lafroig, Ardbeg, and Monkey Shoulder in particular have done excellent jobs aligning themselves with cocktails on menus, where Johnny Walker, Ardbeg, and Balvenie still continue to be players on single spirit lists. If you're going out to a bar and you're going to have a nice single malt neat, this is where a lot of people look to a good list of Balvenie or Johnny Walkers on a list, where if you look at most of the modern cocktail lists nowadays, that's where you'll find brands like Monkey Shoulder really displaying its ability to mix and fit into some of these bar programs. Rye whiskey, something that really hasn't changed much over the last decade, is Rittenhouse. This is a workhorse brand for every bar manager, bartender that is in the industry, and we all know it. When you look at quality to price point, That's a main reason why this brand continues to be in the #1 spot. It's significantly lower priced when placed inside of a base or a well cocktail than you would find from a Whistle Pig or a Michter's type brand, making it a more full range application. But not to shortchange the rest of the brands listed here, as we know. Michter's Wild Turkey, which was a very top brand in last year's report. We see a little bit of slip there. But Rittenhouse, again, continuing to be tried and true over the test of time with leading bartenders and accounts. Mezcal, again, another category where we can lean back on historics and look at Del Maguey and the Pernod Ricard portfolio. Let's be honest, this is the brand that introduced Mezcal to most bartenders in the United States of America inside of cocktails. So it's not a surprise to me that it maintains that #1 spot despite all of the brands that continue to emerge. And if we look at the other brands that are listed on here, El Higorio, Ilegal, El Higorio, what a fantastic brand to see being impacted on this list. So small just a few years ago. And then I see some of the brands that I see really take a jump regionally, like Banez and Ilegal, which leads in a lot of markets. The Mezcal category has so many brands inside of it, but again, just like bourbon, when we look at it, it continues to be the top 5 to 6 brands that drive successfully inside of these key accounts. I hope that everybody has found this information useful, and I want to point out that this is just a small piece of what we have to offer. This is a data report that is associated with 135 venues. At Overproof, we maintain over 200,000 venues in our US database with over 2 million menus. This gives us the opportunity to look at reports like this on a daily basis with our finger on the pulse of what's happening on premise inside the market. If anybody would like to have more information or talk about how you can apply this data to you as a supplier and to your route to market strategy, please reach out to an Overproof representative. We love data, and we would love to talk to you about how our data can help your supplier thrive in today's marketplace. My name is Nistico. On behalf of Park Street and Overproof, I thank everybody for their time today, and I hope everybody enjoys Tales of the Cocktail and our Tales of the Cocktail Breaking Down the Bar report.